All right, welcome to Chapter 10. We're going to talk about externalities in this chapter. So the premise of this chapter is, the previous chapters we talked about, is the way to gain efficiency is to let the price adjust up and down be moved by the visible hand until quantity supplied equals quantity demand. And that's what we call the optimal quantity. And that's going to maximize total surplus, both consumer and producer surplus, so we're efficient. However, not always does this work. Sometimes free markets break down and are inefficient. An example of this is when there's externalities involved. So an externality is when there is an uncompensated cost or an uncompensated benefit caused by the market. So let's look at the market for electricity. So each of us, we need electricity to power our devices so that we can play Fortnite. All right, so this demand curve, let's go back to black. This demand curve is us. We demand electricity. Well, there are companies that supply electricity. One way to think of a supply curve is a cost curve. As companies face these costs, we call that a private cost because it's the cost that each company faces. So for example, if you're going to use coal to create electricity, a coal-burning power plant, there are costs to produce electricity. As a coal-burning power plant wants to increase the quantity, the costs are going to increase, or the price is going to increase because they need to buy more coal, hire more workers, buy a bigger plant, whatever that might be. So there is some cost that they're going to face, and that's to the firm. However, when you burn coal, it also creates pollution. That pollution doesn't just sit over the coal-burning power plant. Instead, it goes up into the air, floats down, and makes it quite unpleasant for people living in the town nearby. That's what we call an uncompensated cost. That pollution that's created, the coal-burning power plant doesn't care about that much because it doesn't affect them in their decision to produce. But it does affect society. And so when we think about a negative externality, so this is an example of a negative externality. And what that means is by producing, there is not just a private cost, but there's also a cost to society. And that difference is the externality. And so what this says is that at the optimal price, so this optimal price right here, the optimal quantity should be lower than where it's at currently. So too much is being produced. And so the social optimal amount is not to produce at that price, but instead to charge a slightly higher price such that we reach this quantity here, which is our socially optimal quantity. And so this is the example of a negative externality. A company that produces an uncompensated cost to others around it, produces too much of the good. And so when we think about this, is a free market produces too much of a good where there's a negative externality. And so we're going to later talk about solutions to this. But one solution is simply just to make sure that the price is higher so the quantity is lower.